Hello and welcome to Mandatory Redistribution Party. What is it to be English? What is England? For me, a Welsh man, England is the country that invaded my one and later consolidated its power so effectively that most people in Wales don't even speak our own language. Yeah, some of that's on me, but I've got to level 3 a Duolingo. What more do you want? In his new book, New Model Island, How to Build a Radical Culture Beyond the Idea of England, Alex Niven brilliantly argues that the map of the British Isles should be put in the shredder, that we should stop pandering to romanticised patriotism, reject nationalism, and instead move toward radical regionalism. Alex is a writer, poet, former musician, and current lecturer in English at Newcastle Uni. And he's a top lad. We had a right good chat about the ideas in his book, about Mark Fisher, and Alton Towers, which you can hear now. Hello, Alex. How's it going?
Hello, Jack. It's going very well.
Wicked, wicked. I'll get straight to the question that's on every listener's mind. How does it feel to be the Pete Best of everything?
Would we say the Pete Best of everything? would we put it quite like that? I mean, I could talk about that if you want. It's kind of a long and complicated story. I always say there were political, personal and aesthetic reasons for my departure from the band. But it's a long and drawn out.
Give me a headline.
Headline is I just didn't enjoy it, I guess.
It's a good reason to stop doing anything.
So yeah, maybe we'll leave it at that.
Oh my God. I was like, I'll open with a light-hearted question and accidentally opened a creaky door into Alex's soul. I'll delete my frivolous questions such as, is the beautiful vocal harmony in Suffragette?
Right.
Is it who's going to sit on the fence when I'm on your fence when I'm gone, or who's going to sit on your face when I'm gone? There's major debate.
This is like a flashback to 10 years ago, when living in Manchester, we used to get asked that all the time. We always used to say we couldn't possibly reveal the secret to that. It's up to the listener's interpretation.
Like all true art.
Indeed, right. Yeah, indeed.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, let's get into the book. Loved it. An absolute banger.
Thank you.
New Model Island. Why that title?
I was once told in a publishing workshop, I think possibly the only one I've ever been to, that you should try and give your book an upbeat title.
Yeah.
So originally the book was called The End of England, which was a bit kind of dark and depressing. And, you know, if you're kind of browsing through titles in a bookshop, you might not go with something that has such a kind of dismal, apocalyptic spin on it. So I thought New Model Island, upbeat.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's an allusion there to the English Civil War, albeit a kind of distant one, and I'm not quite so sure I'd like to be associated with Cromwell and
hardcore
some of the things he did. Yeah, he did in Ireland particularly.
Yeah.
But New Model Island does what it says on the tin. It's an attempt to think about ways of reimagining the islands, so-called Great Britain, but also the islands in the archipelago more generally, so Ireland and all of the other ones. of which there are 166, I think.
Oh my God.
I learned this while writing the book. So I think this notion of us being an island, singular, is complicated.
And wrong from what you just
indeed,
said. Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
I love it. I also love the idea that book titles should be positive, which is the opposite of the wisdom of putting anything out online. Yeah, like YouTube videos are all called Why X Sucks, with sucks in capital. It could have Why England Sucks, capital letters. Second edition, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe that's a millennial thing. I don't know. I'll think on it.
Yeah,
for the next book.
So you've obviously written a book about the limits of the idea of England, quote England unquote. So are you not a patriot, sir? Do you not love this country?
No. I can answer without any hesitation. I mean, it's not really a case of not loving the country. It's just a case of not really knowing what the country is, and on a very basic level, not thinking that England exists in any kind of meaningful way.
Yeah.
So I think it's very difficult to be patriotic when you don't know what the country is, and you have a kind of slightly sketchy sense of where the country begins, where it ends. You know, are we English? Are we British? Are we, citizens of the UK, including Ireland or bits of Ireland? So I think that makes being patriotic pretty much impossible, as far as I'm concerned.
My perhaps knee-jerk response to such strange McCarthyite accusations is what is there to be proud about? I teach as well as doing stand-up, and there's a weird thing in all teachers' contracts that Gove put in, that we have to sign up to teach British values, which is what the fuck. It lists some things like democracy, and it's like, have we even been? Real dodgy stuff, but. Yeah, I like the response of to "Are you a patriot?" going, well, what even is England? Yeah, because who would be able to answer that? After reading your book, I'm thinking no one.
Well, what do you think?
God knows. I'm Welsh, so when someone says England, I just think, it's very easy to just kind of have a knee-jerk reaction of the thing I dislike. People who own holiday homes drive up house prices in Wales, or
vote Tory.
More likely to vote Brexit in living in Wales with the people who are English people live in Wales as well. Which is I was thinking about this. Is patriotism fundamentally right wing? Because there are some on the left that think we should build a left patriotism that's about all the English things we should be proud of, like the NHS and, I don't know, the levellers, the diggers, the Chartists, kind of. Now there is like a bit of a drive to say build a left patriotism. Do you think that could be a thing, or is that just let's abandon that? What do you reckon?
You say, it is a thing. So there's the kind of Billy Bragg model of rediscovery of English radical roots.
To clarify, Alex has got a quote from Billy Bragg, who I associate with this English patriotism thing, on the front of the book.
Yeah,
and which it's
a little bit awkward.
Yeah.
No, he's a nice guy, and he was very, very kind to provide the quotation. So maybe we'll just leave it at that.
Sorry, I continue.
It's a very kind of noble endeavour. I sympathise with the attempt to, rediscover this kind of radical Englishness. But a couple of things. I mean, the first thing is that I don't think, in terms of the English example specifically, it's ever going to be possible to disentangle English patriotism, nationalism from the right-wing version, which is much, much more powerful, much better established. The idea that you're going to be able to kind of bring together reference points, you listed things like, kind of historical examples like the Levellers, poetry of Milton, Blake, Shelley, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, things like that. I think these are kind of inspiring examples, but I don't really think they're ever going to be able to challenge and replace, the kind of Churchill British bulldog or English bulldog. There's kind of confusion about what's English and what's British.
Yeah, let's get into that. Is there a difference? How do you understand that?
One of the big problems for England is that England sacrificed its sense of self and identity in order to become the British Empire. So firstly, colonising the surrounding countries. Although colonising is a slightly contentious term, it happened in different ways. It certainly became hegemonic over Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and then obviously the British Empire spread throughout the world. And obviously that was an English thing predominantly, but in order to do that, England had to pretend that it was kind of open to absorbing all of these other countries under this umbrella of imperialism. And so England itself really lost its sense of definition. It lost its literal political and geographical outlines, and it lost its sense of identity. It kind of relinquished that to this notion of Britishness. But into the present day, but certainly at the time of the Second World War, for example, you have people identifying as Englishmen, talking about Englishmen as a kind of shorthand for people from Britain as a whole. So you could be Scottish and still an Englishman in this weird terminology. The lines are very blurred, and in such a way that I think it's difficult to imagine disentangling England from this British imperial past and kind of backtracking to 300-400 years before England ceded its identity to this notion of Britain. So I think, that's one big, if not the biggest problem underlying this notion of England.
England, it's imposing itself on other places, diluted its own sense of self, and it had to alter it.
I think, you can have power or you can have soul. You can't have both. And England went for power and lost its soul.
That is a line.
Thank you. I've been thinking about that for some time, planning it, waiting for a moment to
deploy.
Deploy it.
It's got me. It's got the listener. The mind's blown. Casualties all around. Do you think there's uniquely a problem with English patriotism? Pretty much just said that there can't really be a left patriotism, and I get that because to me it seems similar strategy to defences of immigration that focus on the economic value of migrants, which dehumanises them, and only you're arguing on the basis of like, yes, we should determine a human's worth based on their economic value. So that kind of thing of once you're in that bad frame, even arguing against it kind of feeds the monster. So I definitely get that angle. But do you think there could be like a liberatory patriotism, like anti-colonial struggles, or even Welsh, Scottish and Irish patriotism?
So Welsh, Scottish and Irish patriotism are about 1 million times better than English patriotism and nationalism. They emerged in opposition to this kind of imperial culture, as you say. They're often progressive, if not quite left-wing. Nevertheless, they are still emerging out of notions of nationalism that I think are ultimately quite spurious. I live in the northeast of England. I grew up in Northumberland. I sort of identified much more closely with Scotland than the southeast of England. The idea that you kind of cross the border at Berwick or Carlisle and suddenly you're part of a different entity seems a little bit absurd to me. Not that I'm a unionist. I'm very much, in favour of Scottish independence and greater Scottish autonomy. Nevertheless, at some point, Scottish nationalism will come up against problems arising out of the fact that it is a nationalism and it's reductive, and the idea that your kind of identity is shaped wholly or predominantly by your nation just seems a little bit silly to me for all kinds of reasons.
Because what is a nation?
Yeah. Exactly.
Imagined community is the Benedict Anderson thing there.
Exactly,
knows. It developed out of print because it standardised the languages in the areas. I think that's his argument. I haven't read it for a very long time.
Print and also the decline of religion. So nationalism is a kind of substitute for religion when you get the end of Christendom. People in the Middle Ages, most often, this is massively sweeping generalisation, but there's a sense that, in the Middle Ages, let's say 1,000 years ago, you felt yourself to be a part of Christendom. Under the umbrella of the church. That was, civilization, and that was, you're ultimately answerable to God, through the Pope, through, priests and bishops, etc., etc. So obviously that has big problems with it, but, when that collapses, that's one of the things Benedict Anderson argues, that's one of the things that opens the way for nationalism. You have this kind of spiritual or pseudo-spiritual investment in this idea of the nation state, which I think is a little bit tenuous, if not totally ridiculous.
I'm fascinated by the development of the nation state and borders. So only a couple of 100 years ago, you could just pretty much walk across Europe and you wouldn't hit a border. You would hit borders. You'd go over borders on maps, but you wouldn't hit the border.
Sure.
Because the border was like a wall around a city or where the contemporary equivalent of the cops could get you to enforce the border. And then there's all interesting stuff of nationalisms coming after the development of nation states. Because Eric Hobsbawm, really good historian, and also weirdly like hardcore into the Communist Party, maybe for a little too long. But he,
I think that's fair.
A little summary of who Hobsbawm is there, guys. Check him out. He talks about how French nationalism comes after the development of the French nation state. So he argues that about 12% of French people actually spoke the same kind of French in literature and the spoken word in 1789. So the nation is, if we take Benedict Anderson's argument that it's this shared language and that development that builds this idea of the nation, it's like bizarre because the state building happens before the shared concept of we're all French as it exists now. I'm fascinated by it. I find it absolutely bizarre. I'm just coming back to your thing of responding to, are you a patriot with, what even is England? What is any country?
Yeah. I mean, obviously you have to have, I wouldn't want to go in for this incredibly abstract sort of idealistic left internationalism, which says that, you can't have any administrative units. Obviously you have to have some way of governing different parts of the world. But it seems to me that you could do that in a fluid way. I think Scotland, Wales, Ireland provide good models because they're about the right size. They have populations of 3, 5, 7 million, which is about the right size. I mean, obviously in an English context that would imply regionalism, which is one of the things that's advocated in the book. So that, the Northwest, for example, has a population that's bigger than 7 point something million.
Yeah.
Significantly bigger than Scotland, over twice the size of Wales.
Yeah. I think Greater Manchester itself is about the same population as Wales.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think the region seems to me a good size.
Yeah.
If you have to divide the world up, which you probably do for all sorts of administrative reasons, then thinking about regions, that seems to be a better unit than nations.
Absolutely, because an administrative region doesn't require the idea of a nation to uphold it.
And crucially, it doesn't involve ethnicity, which is, the big bad thing about nationalism is its reliance on ethnicity and various kind of myths about ancestry and, race.
Oh, big time.
Et cetera.
So one of the things you say in the book, which is Englishness is almost wholly devoid of ethnological meaning. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, that's a sort of summary of this DNA study. I'm not a scientist, so I think it's fair to say that I was bluffing slightly in analysing that.
You reference the things you say to numerous actual scientists and studies.
Yes. So essentially there was a University of Oxford study 3 or 4 years ago which looked at DNA clusters across the United Kingdom and produced this really interesting map which suggests that there's a relatively homogenous ancestry in the south and east of England. To an extent, there's a basis there for a kind of English ethno-nationalism. But if you do want to kind of go down that path, this sort of homogenous English ethnicity, if you want to call it that, stops at a line that you could draw from about Lyme Regis in the southwest up to Middlesbrough. And there are completely different DNA clusters north and west of the line. So Cornwall has a completely separate one. Devon has a completely separate one. There's a separate one on the Anglo-Welsh border. Completely separate ones in Wales, Scotland and Ireland. A separate one in kind of West Yorkshire going into Manchester. Separate one in Cumbria, separate one in the northeast. Interestingly, in Cumbria and the northeast, they're very closely related to Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Right.
So so there's this idea that if you live in Carlisle or Newcastle, in terms of ethnicity, there's a much closer connection with Glasgow and Belfast than there is with London. So this seems to make a nonsense of English nationalism. Certainly, if you're going to base an imagined community on ethnicity, you have to read the science and realise that it's, again, quite spurious.
I get really uncomfortable about the recent obsession with people finding out their heritage. I think it's a little bit eugenicsy.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of wanted to do this, but I just waited till my sister did it.
Yeah.
Because obviously that was like, getting it for free. Although it was actually quite accurate in our case. So it had, these connections with Northern Ireland and Scotland and then the northwest of England, actually. So it was actually quite accurate. But it's weird, isn't it? I mean... It's, I don't want to bring Rachel Riley into things, but, one of the many slightly sinister things I think she said was talking about her baby having Jewish blood.
Yeah.
There are obvious alarm bells ring when you talk about blood.
Yeah.
And, Jewish blood in particular, very ambiguous, is it kind of racist and
kind
ethnicity?
It's kind of shaped alarm bell.
Yeah, well, let's be careful.
I said it, not you.
Yeah, you said it. But I totally agree. This notion of blood is very dodgy, and it again points or leads ultimately to a kind of right patriotism, right nationalism. Yep. I'd look actually at the Northumbrian example in the book of finding this very, 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 very small Northumbrian blood and soil kind of movement, which was probably just one guy. But this notion of ethnicity and blood is quite obviously not something that we want to have anything to do with. On the left, I would say.
Absolutely. But your point by kind of digging into that stuff is that even on their own parameters,
exactly,
it's bullshit.
Well, perhaps there's, as I say, perhaps there's a kind of English heartland ethnically, but also bear in mind the data was people's grandparents, so it was before the migrations of the later 20th century. But perhaps there is a kind of English heartland. But if you want that, you've
got to give the Cornish independence too.
Exactly, you do. Yeah, if you're going to do it on ethnicity, you have to let basically a third of the country, the north, the west, separate.
Love it. Okay, it's a very specific question here. Could you tell us about 7th century warlord Oswald Iding, known as at the time as Whiteblade, apparently the basis of Aragorn in Lord of the Rings? And obviously how this relates to your book.
Yes. So obviously there's kind of some memoir sections in the book, and I start off by talking about kind of end of 2016, start of 2017, things that were happening in my life at that time, one of which was that my son, who we called Oswald, was born. Oswald was a Northumbrian saint. I've got kind of ancestry in Derry in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, and in Northern England. And obviously I grew up in the Northeast, proposed to my wife on Lindisfarne, which was a monastery that Oswald helped to found after being in exile in Iona in Scotland, which was founded by St. Columba, Colmcille from Derry. It's not politically relevant or interesting at all, but there's kind of family connection there. Obviously Oswald sort of enters the book as a figure from this almost mythical period about which there are very few historical records, the kind of origin point of England, which is the Dark Ages. One interesting thing about this kind of Anglo-Saxon or English period is obviously you have regional organisation at the same time as there is a sense, this is the origin point of this kind of shared sense of the Angle folk. My old English pronunciation is not what it used to be.
Well, who knows how it was pronounced? They're all dead.
Well, indeed. But for all that you have this sense of a shared folk, the Anglo-Saxon England is, well, for a start, it goes into Scotland, in the case of Northumbria, probably. It's oriented around regional kingdoms. So Oswald's a key figure in this period.
Yeah. When I was reading it, I was thinking about the same thing in Wales, because we were talking about Welsh nationalism before and how it tends to be a more progressive force than English nationalism, but itself, like Wales is all this hodgepodge of regions until England really consolidated it into one thing. It was split into all these different principalities where with all different rulers. Gwyned's like the biggest one, but it's the same everywhere. We have these mythologies of Welsh nationalism, Scottish nationalism, English nationalism, but even they break down into regions, and I think that was good. It was a good place to start the book.
Thank you.
Yeah. How did the late, great Mark Fisher inspire your thinking?
So Mark was a colleague of mine at Zero Books, which basically everyone that works from Zero Books sort of resigned. Yeah,
true Zero Books. The one true Zero Books.
Yeah, and formed Repeater, which we very much see as the kind of moral inheritor of Zero's legacy. He encouraged me to write my first book, Folk Opposition. The starting point for that was a blog post about Newcastle United and Raoul Moat. And Mark, being the kind of creative, inspirational person he was, said, why don't you turn this into a book? Just, he thought more deeply and with more perceptiveness about where we are and who we are and how our lives are lived under neoliberalism than anyone else I can think of. He was an inspiration to me, practical inspiration in terms of encouraging me to write and, being a kind of colleague at Zero and Repeater, but also his kind of vision, I think, of this society in which we're kind of psychologically, spiritually impoverished by this sort of crushing sense of capitalism being the only way to go. That was a constant reference point for me, and it still is, even after Mark died, very sadly, obviously, at the start of 2017. And he functions in a similar way for lots of other people. It's almost a kind of secret handshake. You kind of meet people and they have a similar kind of sense of reverence for Mark Fisher. I don't think in a kind of weird way, but just in that similar sense of using him as an inspiration, as you say, and as a kind of benchmark for what is right and what is wrong about the way we live today.
Brilliant. Could you explain, because some listeners might not know, the idea of capitalist realism?
Sure.
And how Englishness functions in a similar way of like preventing new ideas from blossoming and ways out of that, maybe? Is that?
Yeah. Capitalist realism is quite simple. So this is the title of Mark's book of 2009, which basically argues, and this, Mark derived this from, no one's quite sure if it was Slavoj Žižek or Frederick Jameson who first said this, or maybe it's someone else.
Yeah.
But, this notion that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. As I say, this kind of crushing sense that capitalism is the only game in town. You can't even criticize it in any way. It's just a kind of inalienable part of the landscape of the world. So, how does that relate to Englishness? I haven't really thought about this, but I think Englishness is actually a bit more up for grabs. It's not actually a kind of hegemonic mindset or kind of cultural structure of feeling in the way that capitalist realism is. I think these notions of nation and identity are a bit more up for grabs than capitalism, which is not up for grabs at all. It's, it's the way things are. And, anytime anyone, tries to kind of criticize it or suggest different ways of doing things, that's, completely shut down or,
It's pretty tricky to question Englishness though. Like, if a politician could be framed as hating the country, that would be deeply problematic for them. Or as
well, that's true.
And being un-English
Yeah.
is an easy way to make someone appear a villain.
That's true. You hear even Corbyn talking continually about our country. So which country is it? Is it England or is it Britain? So, I think some form of nationalism, some form of patriotism is, as you say, very hegemonic and very functions in a similar way to capitalist realism. But in our specific case, it's ambiguous. It would be very interesting if even someone sort of went up to Corbyn after he said, I'm interested in doing the best for our country. It'd be interesting if someone just said, well, which country?
Yeah.
And
then whatever he said, say, but what is that?
Yeah. On second thoughts, maybe let's keep it as a thought experiment. But so I agree that there is an immense pressure to be patriotic, nationalistic, be proud of our country. But in our case specifically, it's much less ambiguous in France, for example, or even the States. Their country is much more coherent. In our case, it's much more complicated.
Yeah, which is how that there are people able to argue for a left patriotism and things like that. Or argue that British values are diversity and democracy, as the government's own documents suggest. On the subject of patriotism, I was remembering back to when The Guardian leaked the Snowden files back in 2013, and Keith Vaz, Labour MP, who was on the select committee that's Home Affairs, he brings in the editor of The Guardian and asks him point blank, do you love this country? I think the guy tried to say, like, we are patriotic, like leaking these things is the patriotic thing to do, that kind of argument. Fair, in the moment, good. But even people did react to that generally with, what the fuck is Keith Vaz doing? Like, what is this? This is weird. Like, I think Dan Hodges, of all people, who's a Telegraph writer, called it McCarthyism.
Yeah.
So I think
well done, Dan.
Yeah, go on, lad. A rare thing that you'll hear on this podcast. So yeah, I think you're probably right. It is maybe more for grabs and less hegemonic than capitalism.
They're both bad.
Yeah, they're both bad. They're both things it would be best to move beyond.
Yes, yeah.
Cool. So Alex, you outline 3 pillars of Englishness that I absolutely love because they're bleak as fuck. Historical curse, confinement, and void. And in the book, you explore that in relation to Alton Towers. That was like one of my favourite bits of the book. Can you explain that a bit?
I mean, it's quite a strange book. I think
it's real weird.
It is a weird book.
I highly recommend it. That's part of why it's very good.
I mean, I guess, I was lucky enough that I was able to sort of find my way as I went along with the writing of the book and kind of start in some quite strange places in terms of memoir and then kind of use that as a basis for this political social argument. So as well as this kind of memoir stuff about my son and Mark Fisher, I then kind of go into this chapter on Alton Towers and talk about a ride called the Hex and the fact that it is on the edge of this ruin, the real Alton Towers, which is this 19th century Gothic building designed by Augustus Pugin, who also designed the Houses of Parliament. So this sort of opportunistic way of getting into this sense of the Englishness, I think, is very bleak. Englishness, to the extent that it does exist, is a kind of absence of national identity, partly for the kind of reasons that we talked about earlier in terms of England sacrificing its sense of self to the empire. Englishness is most often felt negatively, I think. Going to Alton Towers really brings this home. It's the kind of English Disneyland. So, lots of kind of novelists and cultural theorists have kind of looked at, Disneyland in terms of America and consumer capitalism and postmodernism, et cetera, I wanted to do that for England. So, what is our consumer capitalist myth? The Hex rides,
It's like one of the worst rides in there, right?
Yeah, it's not. It's a kind of bit of a letdown, but it does. The ride in combination with it, being on the edge of this kind of abandoned building, does bring home the three essential facets of Englishness, which I arbitrarily delineate. But why not? Historical curse, this sense that England has never really existed. You get this in King Arthur, the kind of King Arthur myth, that England or Camelot or kind of some kind of ideal kingdom did exist in the past, but then it's kind of gone into hiding. You get it in various other kind of folk tales, this sense of a kind of curse haunting us that we have to somehow break out of. So that's the first thing. Second thing, confinement. This notion that we're kind of a crowded country, which is true in certain contexts, but actually not. There's lots of open space. There's lots of land that isn't built on and developed, but is owned by the vast majority of the land in England and, Britain as a whole is owned by a very small number of people.
Golf courses.
Yeah, golf courses in a modern context, obviously the aristocracy and kind of the landed gentry going back further with this, and they enclosed the land and ensured that most of us didn't have access to most of the land. So that gives us a sense of being hemmed in, I think, of being literally enclosed, which is a kind of cultural mindset that expresses itself in all kinds of ways. The last of the three essential English qualities is void, which kind of touched on already, really, this sense that England doesn't really exist. If you want to put it that way, that's a slight hyperbole. England kind of does exist, but not really. If you ask someone, what is distinctively English as opposed to British, you can count the things on the fingers of one hand. The England football team, the England rugby team, certain kind of arts organisations,
Greggs.
Historic England. Greggs, well, that's a Northumbrian. That's a Geordie thing.
Yeah. Regionalism. So before we start talking about regionalism and maybe a solution of how we might imagine a different and better future away from Englishness, I'd just like to briefly ask you what you think. Given his commitment to financialisation at home and imperialism abroad, why do you think Blair committed to devolution? We got devolution to Scotland and Wales, and it stopped there. Didn't no devolution in England. Why do you think he did that? I mean, if you can even guess. And to what extent do you think not doing some devolution in England as well was a mistake?
Sure. Well, I guess it all comes down to what I would call the early experimental phase of Blairism, which did carry over a lot of the radical ideas of the left in the later 20th century. I mean, albeit half-heartedly. Nevertheless, the Scottish-Welsh devolution referendums were incredible developments, very radical developments. I don't think there's any way a Tory Prime Minister would have gone for it. So I think, there were various ways in which particularly New Labour in its very early years did carry over some of these radical New Left ideas.
Do you think failing to devolve England as well has caused problems then?
New Labour did try to devolve the English regions. So they had a plan to devolve all of the regions, and they were going to start with the northeast, which was regarded as the kind of region that was most likely to go for regional devolution. And there was a referendum in 2004, which was heavily defeated. Dominic Cummings. Interestingly, this was Dominic Cummings' first big project. He spearheaded the No campaign, using a lot of the similar popular cynicism, essentially, that you had with the Brexit referendum, and which is now part of the Tory strategy, kind of popular cynicism. New Labour, by this point, kind of deep into its sort of reaction, after having had this mildly progressive opening phase where they kind of achieve things like Scottish and Welsh devolution,
minimum wage, etc.
Minimum wage, by 2004, I mean, this is after Iraq. New Labour's very much into its tuition fees and foundation hospitals and Iraq phase, and it turns around after the failure of the North East devolution referendum in 2004 and says, if the North East isn't going to go for it, let's abandon the plans. It seems to me a bit silly that you would say that, that kind of has put things to bed once and for all. It was just one poll. As I say, it was, kind of...
But Alex, the people have spoken.
Well, indeed. I mean, the obvious counterpoint is independence referendums in other countries. There being kind of Scottish referendum in 1979 that didn't go through. Nobody turned around and said, right, that's it. Scots have decided once and for all. You had a kind of another referendum in 1997 and then another referendum in 2014. So this was only in one part of the country. So it seems to me a bit silly to consign this idea of regionalism to the dustbin of history just because it failed in one very specific context.
So if not England, then what's the alternative?
As I said, I think regionalism has to be the basis. Rather than thinking about nations, I think thinking about regions is a much better basis for a kind of left egalitarian project, whether that's an actual region or in the case of Scotland and Wales, essentially region-sized countries. Which isn't to diminish, I can sort of hear the Scottish and Irish howls of, you think we're just a region? I don't think that, but I think the analogy between a country like Wales and the Northwest, for example, over double the population, or indeed somewhere like Cornwall and Devon, I don't think there should ever be a Cornish nation because, again, it will always rely on these very dodgy notions of ethnicity and et cetera, and the Cornish language, which is a very meaningful thing, but it's
problematic.
But a Cornish region, an empowered Cornish region, an empowered Northwest and empowered Northeast without any kind of ethnic basis seems to me the way to go. So how you go about doing that is a very big question, and I don't have all the answers, and perhaps no one does. But some revival of this millennial idea of regional devolution seems to me a very, very good starting point. I wouldn't want to stop regional devolution. I think, one of the main spatial narrative about the islands, Britain, Great Britain, the British Isles as a whole, perhaps, is the kind of massive divide between London and its kind of surrounding area and everywhere else.
It's the most regionally divided country in Europe economically.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you look at those statistics, the kind of disparity between, you have London as, I think, the wealthiest or the, on some measure is the kind of wealthiest region in Europe. And then you have, there's dispute about the figures, but you have at least several of the other poorest 10 regions in I think it's Western Europe or Northwest Europe in the rest of the UK. That is the big divide on the islands. It's not really the divide that occurs when you go from, Berwick to 5 miles or 10 miles further north into Scotland. It's the divide between London and the southeast and everywhere else.
And not just an economic divide as well, a divide on almost everything. Culture, sucking up all the art and museums, the comedy industry, which I'm intimately aware of, is a horror show. Yeah, and regionalism is a good solution to that. And I think it parallels a lot of the other stuff that the left's arguing for, increased workplace democracy, for example. And bringing power back to the people. It's along that exact same line of... And people like democracy, right? If you ask someone, do you believe in democracy? Almost everyone is going to say yes. It should be an easy fight. I agree with you. I'm not 100% on the how. And because that's what I was going to ask you. I was like, how do we bring this about? How do we fight for regionalism? How do we build hegemony about that idea? And which you've kind of already answered with, you don't know. But you could take another punt on it if you want.
There's interesting debates to be had about referendums. Referenda, and how they function. Because as we've seen in the case of both the North East devolution referendum and Brexit, you have Dominic Cummings, interestingly in both cases, taking hold of the narrative, hijacking this democratic idea or this kind of sense of democratic feeling that people have, but redirecting it towards the right and towards this kind of sense of cynicism and this sense of, lashing out at the wrong targets, essentially, instead of lashing out at the City of London and the people that are kind of really disempowering you. In both cases, in both, the North East referendum and Brexit, the right is able to, because it controls the media, it controls, it's the establishment, has this kind of overwhelming force of argument. It's able to redirect that sense of disempowerment and desire for more democracy towards cynicism, racism, xenophobia, etc., etc. I suspect if there were referenda about regional devolution tomorrow, they would overwhelmingly collapse. They would be defeated. So I don't know. I think I don't really have a problem with some form of top-down, a reformist government coming in and saying, look, we're going to devolve power to the regions. There are problems with that in terms of it not having this kind of democratic mandate. At the same time, governments come in and do all sorts of things, do all sorts of, reform society in all sorts of major ways. I don't see why you couldn't just have a kind of radical Labour government coming in and essentially starting the ball rolling, at least, towards devolving power to different parts of the country. So, I'm leaning towards, partly, as I say, out of this sort of cynicism about referenda and how they tend to pan out in a capitalist conservative society. I just think, well, get a reformist government in, rip up the map of Britain.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Mandatory Redistribution Party was created and produced by Sean Morley and Jack Evans. Our title theme was created by Ella Jean. Alex's book, New Model Ireland, is published by Repeater Books and is legitimately great. If you enjoy Mandatory Redistribution Party, subscribe, follow us on Twitter @MandoParty, maybe give us a review. Oh, thank you. See ya.